Today, we're going to dive into a really fascinating article from all the way back in 1910. It unpacks one of the biggest global crises of the 19th and early 20th centuries, the opium trade. This is a story about incredible wealth, raw geopolitical power, and one nation's truly desperate fight for its own survival. So, let's get right into it.
Right off the bat, the author of our source material does not pull any punches. He starts with this absolutely devastating quote from an English physician of the time, Dr. Medhurst. Just think about that comparison for a second. He's saying the opium trade was as bad as, if not worse, than slavery, in the sheer human misery it caused. This really sets the stage for the enormous stakes of what they called the Opium Question.
All right, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll look at how opium became this tool for colonial expansion, a civilizational curse. Then we're going to follow the money, because it's always about the money, right? After that, we'll explore China's long history of resisting the trade, their all-out war on the drug in the early 1900s, how the rest of the world reacted, and finally, the unfinished fight that came to a head in 1909.
So our journey starts here by understanding that opium wasn't just a drug problem. The author of our source argues it was an unmitigated curse, something that would fundamentally poison the entire relationship between the East and the West for generations. And this quote? Wow, this just says it all. This was shouted by a Chinese mob at a Western missionary. It perfectly captures that feeling of deep, simmering resentment. I mean, how could the West show up with poison in one hand and then try to teach you about virtue with the other? That incredible hypocrisy was right at the heart of this entire conflict.
So what was really driving all of this? Was it an accident? Well, according to the author, not at all. He boils it down to one word: cupidity. Basically, extreme, insatiable greed for wealth. He argues that the spread of opium wasn't some natural thing. It was a deliberate business enterprise, a powerful engine of Western action, all fired by the pursuit of just massive, massive profits.
Okay, so let's follow that money trail. This was not a market that just popped up on its own. The source is really clear on this. It was a market that was manufactured. It was built on addiction, and it was sustained by military force, all for the sake of the bottom line.
And the profits? They were just staggering. The author estimates that over about 130 years, the profit from Indian opium sold in China, and that's pure profit above the cost, was 436 million pounds. I mean, that's an almost unimaginable amount of money back then. And that number, right there, is the key. It explains the relentless, brutal pressure to keep this trade going, no matter how many lives it destroyed.
Now, it's absolutely crucial to understand this point. China did not want this. The source quotes a famous Chinese statesman, Li Hengcheng, who put it plainly. He said, legalizing opium wasn't a choice. It was a submission, a surrender forced on them by, in his words, the adverse decision of arms. In other words, by losing two wars that were fought specifically to pry their country open to the drug trade.
So being forced into this trade led to, as you can imagine, a long and bitter struggle. The huge pushback we see in the early 1900s wasn't some new thing. As the source shows us, it was really just the final chapter in a fight that had been going on for nearly 2 centuries. And this timeline really lays it all out. Look at this. As early as 1729, you've got an imperial edict trying to ban opium dens. Then, in 1839, China publicly condemns the foreign traders for the damage they're doing. And what happens? That leads directly to the First Opium War. And then the Second. And the end result of all that fighting was the forced legalization of the very thing they had spent over 100 years trying to stop.
But then, in 1906, something really did change. After decades of being forced to accept the trade, China decided it was time to take its destiny back. They launched this incredibly bold, unprecedented national campaign to fight back. This was it, the famous anti-opium decree. And it was a stunner. The plan was to completely get rid of opium, not just the foreign imports, but their own domestic poppy fields too, in just 10 years. The author points out that this was such a massive step that even the most powerful governments in the West would have flinched at the idea, especially since it meant giving up a huge chunk of government revenue. And this wasn't just some empty political promise. The source is filled with reports from observers on the ground, including British officials, who said China was in dead earnest. They described an awakening of a national conscience. The movement became immensely popular. You had farmers literally ripping their own poppy crops out of the ground. And get this, the military made opium use a capital offense. This was a nation completely mobilized for change. So China's dramatic move basically forced the rest of the world to pick a side, and as the author lays out, the world split right down the middle. It became a battle between those who supported the reform and those who wanted to protect their profits.
And that division was pretty stark. On one side, you have the reformers. You've got China, of course, but also Japan, which was treating addiction as a medical problem, and the United States, which pushed for total prohibition. But on the other side, you have the reluctant. Great Britain, who started the whole thing, only agreed to a slow reduction if China proved it was serious. And the Netherlands? They were running a state-owned monopoly designed to increase opium sales for profit.
You know, the Dutch position really says it all. Their delegates went to an international meeting and openly said that getting rid of opium was an unattainable ideal. And why? Because it was a principal source of colonial revenue. It couldn't be clearer. This was the core of the whole opium question: morality versus money.
So this global showdown finally came to a head in 1909. At the urging of the U.S., an international commission gathered in Shanghai to finally, hopefully, deal with this crisis on a global scale. This was supposed to be the moment of reckoning.
The American team showed up with a very clear, very ambitious game plan. Their proposals, which were pretty radical for the time, were designed to do one thing and one thing only: completely dismantle the global opium trade. From the poppy fields to the government profits to the opium dens. They wanted to end it, period. But look what they ended up with. The author uses the word emasculated to describe what happened to the American proposals. Instead of clear, decisive action, the final resolutions are full of this weak, non-binding language. They recognize China's sincerity, they recommend gradual suppression, they urge governments to maybe rethink things. It was a classic diplomatic compromise, designed to let everyone off the hook and protect those financial interests.
So in the end, the Shanghai Commission was a huge moral victory for China. The whole world officially agreed that their struggle was sincere. But in practice, it fell way short. By putting compromise first, the Commission failed to create that binding, global ban that the reformers were hoping for. The fight was far, far from over. And that really brings us to the final thought here. The author, writing way back in 1910, saw this whole story as a fundamental clash between the health of a nation and the profits of a powerful industry. So you look at our world today with all of our own public health crises and our own debates over regulation, and you just have to ask yourself, is that fight really over?